Welcome to Issues and Answers with Diane Kinderwater. Issues and Answers is presented as a public service to New Mexicans by State Employees Credit Union, who have been proudly serving the families of New Mexico locally and abroad since 1958. State Employees Credit Union is ready to help you and your family with all your financial goals. And now, Issues and Answers with Diane Kinderwater.
Welcome back to the program. I'm Diane Kinderwater. Thanks for watching. We appreciate KCHF TV for bringing you Issues and Answers every week. And we're going to be continuing our discussion with Joe Abbin. He is the author of Albuquerque Blues, Crime and Policing in Albuquerque, New Mexico. He's done an update using federal statistics on how New Mexico ranks. We all know either ourselves or our neighbors have been a victim of crime. We know that, but he's got the statistics that prove it. On the show, we're going to offer you some hope. What can be done once we know how down we've gone, down this tunnel of crime. And once we know that we're at the bottom, hopefully there'll be some decisions made where we can get back up and see the light of day and not be afraid in our homes or in our neighborhood. So please stay with us as we talk to Joe Abbin about crime and the statistics and how bad we are. We'll be back right after this. The most recent FBI statistics on crime in Albuquerque, it's been calculated, won't come out until end of perhaps September. We're doing this program in August, so we're using some statistics from 2018, and this is what Joe Abbin has compiled of FBI statistics. So Joe, thanks for being a part of our program again and being here to discuss, as you call us, a national disgrace.
It's a pleasure to be here. I like
it's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. I hate delivering this message, but that's been my mission for the last 2 years, is trying to make people aware of how bad we are, and if we acknowledge the problem, it might help us to solve the problem.
Joe is the former chairman of the Foothills Community Policing Council. He's also a former reserve officer at APD, correct?
Correct.
And had worked at Sandia as an engineer and manager there, but very involved with the Albuquerque police. And I think you write our current police chief often, don't you? I've got some of your letters. We'll talk more about that. And also regarding these statistics with the FBI, you've compiled these and you actually talk to FBI. You give your presentation to those officers as well.
It's amazing that they would want to have a briefing on a source that uses them as a source. It's interesting. Most people are not aware. I mean, you become aware if you watch TV, the news at night, if you read the paper. It's just one horrendous crime after another, and the themes are recurring. These are not first-time offenders. These are habitual offenders, shouldn't even be on the street, and that's one of the things we can get to. But most people, unless, as I mentioned, grandma is killed in the den, they don't realize how bad it is. In fact, they don't get too excited as long as it's the neighbor that is burglarized and not them.
But
everybody does their part.
They could be them next. It could be them next. You have a number of statistics from the FBI, again, from 2017-18. When we're talking about violent crimes in New Mexico, Albuquerque is ranked 4th highest in the nation, and I think 4 times as many violent crimes as the national average.
3.7. We're almost 4 times as bad as the
We're talking about
average.
Homicide, aggravated assault, robbery, rape, and those are just violent
Those are the
crimes.
top 4.
Top 4. And property crime would be auto theft, auto burglary, commission of a burglary, residential burglary, commercial burglary, and larceny.
Yeah, and larceny includes a lot of things like shoplifting, just somebody stealing your lawnmower off your porch, that kind of thing.
Which they do. Some people say their ornaments at Christmas time are stolen off.
Oh yeah, just leave your
yards.
bicycle outside and see how long it lasts. You know, my own son was telling me, he says, "Dad, you're off the chart on this." He says, "It's not that bad where I am," and he lives around right on the edge of Borellis, 7th and Iron down there. And I said, well, son, just in the last week, there were 2 bodies found in the street within a block of you. And the previous Thursday, just before our call when we were discussing this, his own Subaru had been stolen and not recovered.
So what's wrong with your son?
Well, in his view,
How much
And
worse
for
can
a
it
lot
get?
of people,
How much worse
that's
can it
the
get?
new normal. And you'll hear people say, when I relate these facts, the factual situation, they'll say, hey, this is Albuquerque. And as we talked about in the other segment, we've been bad for a long time, but we've got especially bad in the last 5 years, 5 or 6 years.
What were you saying about I-40, south of I-40? What happened?
Oh, I would say if you look at crimemapping.com, which is an interesting thing that's accessible by anybody, and you look at the little teardrops they put on there for each crime, that 80 to 90% of the homicides now are south of I-40. And it extends not just in what we would call the international zone now, it actually goes all the way to the volcanoes. I mean, including where my son is on 7th and Iron.
So the international district is basically Louisiana in central?
Well, it's south of the freeway, south of Central and concentrated, and roughly, it goes all the way maybe from San Pedro up through Eubank.
So we're considering that was one of the most violent, with violent crimes and property crimes in that area.
Correct.
But now you're saying it's spreading.
Well, what we see is certainly the homicides. Homicides are one of the statistics I don't like to use because I don't like homicides, but you can't monkey with those figures. The victim either died or they didn't. And there's a lot of homicides, and they're almost all on the south side of the freeway.
And where do you get your statistics? You're sharing this with KCHF TV has brought you in here, allowing you to share this, but how accurate are your numbers?
I feel pretty good about my numbers. I use primarily in the book all the charts and stuff in there. I use the FBI statistics. They're the gold standard. Now, the FBI statistics, as I mentioned, they come from the individual cities involved. So Albuquerque, unfortunately, was not giving the FBI the same statistics as they were giving you and I. It made the locals a lot more comfortable than they should have been. But
and
that's
this was about a couple of years ago, last year?
Yes, that was roughly
19,
20, yeah, 19.
And the Albuquerque
fall.
Journal discovered that, I think.
Yeah, and actually, I preached about that myself, because if I tried to add up the statistics that the city published in just our local newspaper, the Journal, and look at what we turned into the FBI, there was some anomalies, let's say, and I don't want to go into that any further because
So studying and mapping the city, what can you tell us?
Now that studying the mapping, there is, and they get their statistics from APD, I should point. There is crimemapping.com. And
you've studied that.
And it's available to anybody. Yeah, they can.
So what can you tell us about our city? Let's start.
There are hot spots, let's put it
Okay.
that way. And I just mentioned that the hot spot for homicides extends almost across the city, from the west side clear to the Foothills. Foothills, one of the safest areas. Right outside the gate, one of the worst areas. So it's interesting that they could be right next to each other like that. But there's reasons for that. The demographics are different. The one uses private security. Blah, blah, blah.
So that's for homicides. What about theft, larceny?
They go together, really. There's, you'll see that where homicides are not as predictable, let's say, because a lot of them are crimes of passion or crimes where they're eliminating the competition, for instance. But property crimes, they're spread all over, because if you're a thief, you tend to rob poor people because that's where you live. But then, if you really want to do a good job, you go to the northeast foothills. You go to the north side. So, because you want to spend your time wisely and steal better cars and steal better merchandise.
How are auto thefts now here?
According to the Journal now, and this is it's from an insurance company database. They claim that we are number 2 in auto theft, coming down from number 1. Now that's a different database than the FBI stats. So Next month we'll know what the FBI stats are, because not every car that's stolen is insured, for instance. So
they're not.
But anyway, that's interesting. That statistics on their own. Auto theft is big everywhere. Not so big in New York, for instance, because there's not that many cars. They're mostly on foot, as an example, you know. But they show us as number 2 in back of Anchorage, Alaska. Now, I can count. I don't know anything about Anchorage.
You brought us a slide that shows why are we so bad. Well, the answer is what?
The answer is most crime is caused by criminals, and the reason we have more crime is we have more criminals on the street.
You're showing a correlation between the Albuquerque Metropolitan Detention Center (MDC) and the Population and Violent Crime Index. Tell me a little bit of how they're crossing. This is from 2010 to 2019. They're crossing.
And people will attack me and say, well, that's not one-to-one. If the guy is not in jail, he's not necessarily committing a crime. That's true. But if you look at the trends and you look at the population of the jail, and that doesn't include the population of the prison in Santa Fe. And a lot of people don't know the difference between a jail and prison. Jail is for people that have sentences of less than a year, or people waiting on trial. Prison is over a year, so it tends to be felonies. But anyway, if you look at our population of our jail, and we hit it a little bit on the last deal, we were overcrowding, and so we started releasing prisoners on their own recognizance in many cases. That's called ROR, release on your own recognizance.
This is around 2014, 2015.
Right, and we started cutting them loose. And we see that the MDC population is going down. And guess what? Immediately at the same time, violent crime, and this is the average of those 4 categories that you mentioned, going up, 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 and they track together. And now some people would say, well, that's just a coincidence. But the thing that makes that and that's an update from what's in the book, is that in scientific circles, okay, if 2 things behave in one direction, what happens if you try to replicate and go back the other way? Does the curve change? And that's what that slide 6 shows, is that when we started arresting more people and putting them in jail, by golly, the crime goes down. And so if we wanted to do an instant improvement in Albuquerque in the crime problem, we would start arresting more people, prosecuting more people, and incarcerating more people. And I'm not talking about mass incarceration. We incarcerate about 2/10 of our population. That's hardly mass incarceration. And the people that say, well, yeah, they're in there for years for an ounce of marijuana. No, they aren't. Just go through and in fact, I tell people, go out to the MDC, throw a dart at the list of prisoners, and take that guy out to lunch. It's almost always a guy. and get to know a crook. Take a crook to lunch, and see what
Why
he's
do you
in
say
it.
this, Joe Abbin? Why?
Well, they're not in there for minor crimes for the most part.
Okay. So you were, again, the former chair of the Foothills Community Policing Council, and you were a reserve officer at APD.
Right.
Do we still have that Foothills Community Policing Council?
Yes, we do.
What's the status of that?
It's been in the community policing councils have been in existence for 5 years. And each area command, including Foothills, has a community policing council. And the goal was to increase communication between the officers in each area command and the people they serve in each area command. And it's done that to a large extent. I had actually had enough after 5 years of it. But I did feel it was achieving part of its goals. I would have liked to have seen us have more contact with the officers, not the brass in each area command, but the officers on the street. Get together, get to know each other. And we had a few of those, and they were very well received. There was a major shakeup, and I would call it chaotic, in the community policing councils were supposed to be independent of the police department. In other words, to increase communication, but not to be just a cheering section for the police department, and likewise not just to be a beef session. So I feel that our Foothills was a very successful council. We had great participation. We had great speakers.
Where did you meet?
We met at the community center on Comanche, and I forget what its name is now. It's on Comanche between Tramway and.
Is it the isn't the YMCA right there?
Yes, it's right a block from the YMCA.
Okay,
yeah,
a different place.
it's a city facility.
Okay.
And kind of centrally located in the Foothills.
So
but then
they're still meeting.
They're still meeting. They're meeting virtually now, which is I
sure.
think will hurt it hurts communication incredibly, as you might guess. But I have been concerned. They moved the idea was that the police department was interfering with the community policing councils. In other words, overly influence them, and so they changed it and they moved it as of after the first of the year. That now it's not being overseen, if you will, by the police department. It's being overseen by the CPOA, which is the Citizens Police Oversight Agency. Now, that doesn't sound bad, except that if you're an officer and you have a citizen as a ride-along, and they find out that you answer to the Police Oversight Agency, they look at you as a snitch. And there's not going to be open and honest communication. And I always felt, or have felt, that if they're going to be anywhere, it ought to be under the Office of Neighborhood Associations, because they're very similar. The meetings, they have a news note. They are independent of the police department.
The neighborhood associations. Does the police department listen to the neighborhood associations, and how do they communicate?
That's a good question. I would say most of these, there's not a huge influence. I also was an officer in our neighborhood association, the Holiday Park Neighborhoods Association, and that's democracy at work, those neighborhood associations. And this is my guess, they don't agree on anything. but they did have an established line of communication with the officers in the area. They didn't meet on the same frequency, and our neighborhood association was sued by one of our neighbors who was mentally ill, and actually brought our association to its knees. She sued each of the officers independently and the association as a whole, because she felt like she'd been shunned and was discriminated against. Ooh, that strikes a blow.
Those are neighborhood. Let's move on to the reserve officer. Reserve officers. I think they began in the mid 1970s during
correct.
the. I don't know if they were the race riots or if they were the Vietnam War protests. And tell me your involvement and what's been going on with the reserve officers.
Well, we had major riots in Albuquerque in 1971 and 72, and primarily associated with the Vietnam conflict. But they ended up being destructive riots too, where similar to what we've seen in Portland and Seattle.
And a little bit similar to what we had in Albuquerque this summer?
Yes, more extensive though.
More extensive back then,
we had students that took over the Student Union building, changed the doors closed. The governor called in the National Guard, and the National Guard and the police department responded to that. And there were some unfortunate circumstances. There was a few students got bayoneted, and nobody killed, but it was not a good thing. So the police department recognized at the time they had no sprint capability. They had no ability to take on an unexpected event like those riots. And so in 1974, they started the reserve program and their first reserve academy, and then that was they hit the street in 1975.
Were you involved back then?
No, I did not become involved until 1983.
Okay.
And when in 1983 I saw in the Sandia Lab News that we had a reserve program. I'd always been interested in police work.
So who can be a member? Who could have been a member of the reserve officers?
You had to meet the same requirements as a regular officer as far as fitness, moral character, and so they had screening program very similar. The Reserve Academy was about 2/3 of the regular police academy because, and they did several things that allowed that to happen. They only took people in the Reserve Academy who were physically fit to begin with, and they didn't have to be brought up to standard by the physical training part of the Reserve Academy.
So you were trained in handling weapons?
Absolutely, yeah. We had you become a barroom lawyer. We were part of first responders, so basic first aid, the law, dealing with your weapons, personal defense, dealing with the public.
And how were you used? You weren't a sworn what were you a sworn type of officer?
Yeah, sworn officer, and we always worked with a regular officer. So we were paired with a regular officer, and that was done for several reasons. First of all, that the regular officers had to do it day to day, so they were usually more proficient in the paperwork, and so the two of them working together.
So the reserve officers were trained, but were just mainly used for unexpected situations?
No, not really. The requirements became, in order to provide your proficiency, that we had to go through all the in-service training that the regular officers had to do, and then we had to work at least one shift a month.
Really? Okay.
And we could work, and they did have call-outs, but not very often. Thank God we didn't have any riots or things. The only time that I remember actually being called out, having to go, we had a major power failure in the Northeast at the time, and they were worried about looting and rioting in the dark. But that's the only call out. But the rest of the time we just worked along with the other officers, and I worked in every area command in town and every shift. And I actually served under 12 different chiefs. So I have and for 36 years, it gave me a kind of a perspective that there's not anybody in the police department that has that perspective.
Because you worked all around in the different.
Right.
Were these reserve officers paid?
They were not paid. They were patrol, and another thing I should point out, they're the lowest ranking officers in the police department. They are patrolman second class, which is the same as the officers as they get out of the academy. They're officers.
So we had these reserve officers. You were one for 36 years.
Right.
Did you wear a uniform?
Yes, we wear the same uniform. The only difference, and we carried the same equipment, drove the car. We had to meet the same requirements. The difference was my badge, instead of saying first class, which would be when I was typically working with a patrolman first class, it said reserve on it. So that's the only difference.
So why was this program ended?
You know, Diane, there's a lot of
Especially when you have a big crime problem seems like you'd like all the help you can get.
Oh, you'd think, and it's to me, that's another disgrace. Why was the program ended? And the answer was, that's one of those things that I worked for years, did my worksheets, turned them in monthly, and we, up through 2015, we had a monthly or bi-monthly meeting, and so I knew the other reserve officers. After that, they just quit having meetings, and the program really died of benign neglect. And why? There's reasons we can surmise for that. At one time, we were 100 officers, active reserve officers.
Wow.
And that was in the year 2000, roughly.
In this one, we would see officers actually on the streets. People say
Absolutely.
we don't. Now we say we don't see an officer ever.
At Sandia, where I worked at the time, we had 9 reserve officers.
And we have just 2 minutes to go. So share what happened.
I
in
think
2 minutes, what happened to this program?
Well, it died of benign neglect, and quite frankly, the union has never been happy with volunteers of any kind. They look at it as actually stealing their bread right out of their mouth. So that's one problem.
But we had 100 officers at the height, maybe in 2000.
Right.
But why were they still not assigned to their different duties once a month?
They all had to meet their requirements.
But didn't they ride along? They have one shift. You said they had one shift.
Yes.
So was it the reserve officers who decided not to continue any longer? Was it the
Well, there's a natural attrition. Some of them age out, get scared out, or they just don't have the time. It is a big commitment, the in-service training.
So you've been trying to contact our current police chief and ask him what?
Well, and we had a luncheon schedule, and that kind of went to pot because of the COVID thing. And The chief, I don't want to add to his plate, his problems, but quite frankly, the reserve program to me was the highest form of community service that you can offer to the city. And it was the best ambassador program for the police department within the citizens. I mean, you are one 98% of the time.
So we don't
you're a
have it
citizen.
now.
We don't have it now. It was suspended in March of last year, and then it was terminated in January of this year.
Terminated, completely terminated.
Yeah, and we had at our
At a height when we're number one in the country or two of violent crimes, property crimes, auto thefts.
It doesn't make sense. It should have been grown. In fact, as a part of the Foothills Community Policing Council, and we recommend that they resurrect the reserve program and with a goal of 200 officers by next year. Why couldn't we use that? Why can't we do that? Well, the police department's response was, "Whoa, that's a big training requirement, and we're not manned to do that in there." But then they also refused to even allow retiring officers to become part of the reserve program, which they were. So you have a person that's already trained,
throwing your hands up,
and he could go right in without any further training.
What?
No can do. So that's one thing that'll be one of my thrusts will be to try to encourage the reserve program to be resurrected.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that with our audience, that we had it was strong, it was successful, disbanded, and you're trying to get it back. Thank you, Joe Abbin, former chairman of the Foothills Community Policing Council and the author, again, of Albuquerque Blues. Thanks for all the research you've done, and thank you for being a guest and informing our audience here. Appreciate you watching. Have a great week. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Issues and Answers with Diane Kinderwater is presented as a public service to New Mexicans by State Employees Credit Union, which has proudly been serving the families in New Mexico locally and abroad since 1958. State Employees Credit Union is ready to help you and your family with all your financial goals and is the exclusive sponsor of Issues and Answers with Diane Kinderwater in order to inform, educate, and better the lives of New Mexicans. To comment on today's program or to purchase a DVD copy of any Issues and Answers program, visit sunbroadcasting.org or call us at 505-345-1991.